Whether they were fighting the power, fighting for equality, or fighting for the lives of others, these protests will stay in our memories forever.
People are building barricades to keep the police out, or try to.
Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 21st century protests.
When the police tried to intimidate protesters and blocking the way, people stood their ground and kept going forward.
For this list, we've focused on major protests or social movements that happened in or after the year 2000, and ranked them based on their importance and impact on society.
Concentrate on them. Concentrate on bringing unemployment down, taxes down, making Spain a better place to live.
Number 10, the Umbrella Movement, Hong Kong.
If we don't stand up for ourselves today, they walk over us.
Coming about during the Hong Kong protests of 2014, this political movement uses an umbrella as a metaphor for their solidarity in fighting against Hong Kong's government. At the time, the government had passed a decision to make major pro-government changes to their election system. In response, crowds that would sometimes reach 100,000 at a time would protest in favor of democracy and use umbrellas to defend themselves against pepper spray, which by itself caused more people to get involved. The movement continued as of mid-2015. Number 9. Occupy Wall Street, USA.
And all of a sudden it's just pepper spray. They just we already pushed back as far as possible, and they just pepper sprayed everyone.
They called themselves the 99%, and they came out in full force to fight against the remaining percent in the equation. Beginning in September 2011, at New York's Gezi Park in the city's Wall Street district, OWS saw people come in droves to occupy the park as a form of protest against wealth gaps and lack of opportunity in the U.S.
And that's what I love about this so far, is that people are peaceful, they're respectful, and that it seems to come from a place of love.
Some celebrities and musicians rallied in support of the movement, while protesters also occupied places like banks and foreclosed homes. It helped to ignite the worldwide Occupy movement, which protested global inequality and continues to this day as various groups around the planet work toward common goals. Number 8, the Gulabi Gang, also known as the Pink Sari Movement, India.
3 boys come, they pick her up, they rape her, they throw her, they walk away. They have absolute impunity, and they have good reason to believe that nothing will happen to them.
With rape and domestic abuse having already been a big problem in the country beforehand, it was time for women in India to stand up against violence against women. With that, the Pink Sari Movement began. A group of women called the Gulabi Gang banded together to raise sticks against violent men and wear pink saris as a metaphor for strength. The group has been active around North India since 2007 and continues to fight not only against oppression and abuse against women, but also against child marriage.
But ever since the birth of the Gulabi Gang, there has been some improvement. Some women can enforce some of their rights.
Number 7. The LGBTQ movement, Russia.
The government is not taking any care to defend homosexuals who are being harassed and murdered by organized groups of neo-Nazis.
While the movement isn't a 21st century invention, it really began to gain steam in the 2000s.
Normal families, real families, are 10 times more stronger than this so-called same-sex couples and unions.
Not exactly known for embracing the LGBTQ community, or, as the Republic under President Vladimir Putin puts it, non-traditional sexual relationships. Mass protests were held in Russia ahead of 2014's Sochi Olympics.
It seems to me that the law we adopted doesn't harm anybody. What's more, people, homosexual people, can't feel inferior here, because there is no professional, career or social discrimination against them.
This occurred after Putin passed a controversial law banning gay propaganda in 2013, which caused major uproar among the gay community in Russia and worldwide. Other examples of dissent against the Russian government's decision-making around this time include Femen flashing Putin, as well as the fallout from Pussy Riot going to jail for hooliganism. Number 6. Gezi Park protests, Turkey.
Bu akan bizim kanımız ya, bizim kanımız. Bu akan kan bizim kanımız.
What started off as a small protest against the plans to bulldoze trees in Istanbul's Taksim Gezi Park to create a shopping mall turned into something much bigger. These protests ended up being about freedom of the press and expression, the desire for fair elections, and against intrusion by the government on secularism in the country. Lasting almost 3 months during 2013, these demonstrations and periods of civil unrest were a response to brutal police treatment of a peaceful sit-in protesting the urban development plan.
Are there a lot of people coming into your emergency clinic?
Yesterday there were approximately 500 people.
500
people, yeah. And some of them, they were badly hurt.
Up to 22 people were killed, with thousands more injured. But the plans for redevelopment of the park were thrown out. Number 5. The Ferguson unrest, the USA. A major example of something that has unfortunately become a problem in the US in recent years. On August 9, 2014, an unarmed black teenager, Michael Brown, was shot and killed by a white policeman in Ferguson, Missouri.
The officer gets out of his vehicle and pursues Michael as he's shooting his weapon. Michael jerks his body as if he was hit, then he turns around, faces the officer, and puts his hands up, and the officer continues to shoot him until he goes down to the ground.
The next day, the first wave of both peaceful and violent protests in Ferguson began and lasted just over 2 weeks. In November of that same year, another wave of protesting began after the officer, Darren Wilson, was not indicted for his crimes. In connection to both waves of protests, 211 arrests were made and more than 15 people were injured. A third wave of protests and civil disorder began on the first anniversary of the shooting and lasted for approximately 2 days. Number 4. The anti-austerity movement, Europe.
Many companies with a lot of profit, they are laying off many people, and they have to know that we are living the worst crisis in the last 70 years.
After the beginning of Europe's debt crisis, caused in large part by Greece, not to mention the worldwide recession starting in the late 2000s, the anti-austerity movement began across Europe. Following orders by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank for governments to reduce spending on social safety nets, as well as many other reasons, mass protests happened in affected countries like Spain, Ireland, and Portugal.
We have no government. We are being robbed. So I'm here to demonstrate my discontent because it's enough.
In 2015, Greece would become the first country in the developed world to default on the IMF, with anti-austerity actions continuing on throughout the year.
The voice of workers is saying, don't go for austerity. Don't do what your predecessors did in the 1930s. Don't cut all of you at the same time and risk the results that they had in the 1930s, which was a Great Depression.
Number 3. The Orange Revolution, Ukraine.
If they shoot us, if they send tanks, no matter what, there's nothing that can overpower the will of the people.
While the 2013 Euromaidan protests were also a contender for this list, we've given the nod instead to this protest movement from the earlier part of the century.
Нарешті люди пробудилися. Україна стала з колін. Вже неможливо терпіти тієї брехні і знущання з людей.
For 2 months in the Ukraine, people protested in large numbers against the controversial outcome of the country's 2004 presidential election, which was shrouded by fraud, extreme corruption, and rigging in favor of candidate Viktor Yanukovych. Following the protests, which included civil disobedience, sit-ins, and strikes, the original election results were annulled and a second election was held, with his opponent Viktor Yushchenko winning. Number 2. Anti-war protests of Afghanistan and Iraq worldwide.
It's hard to think of any one event that has brought so many different nations' protest movements together in that way.
Although the international solidarity movement was also in the running for this list, there was no way we couldn't include the one that ultimately made the cut.
Stop the massacres! Stop the war! U.S. out of Afghanistan!
These protests have run for almost a decade and a half, and they're still going strong.
No war! No war, no war, no war.
Ever since they began a month after 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have caused protests in many different countries, particularly in the Western world. The wars themselves have caused the loss of over 31,000 lives and cost billions of dollars. Before we unveil our top pick, here are a few honorable mentions.
Hundreds of thousands of people paralyzed cities across the country over a 20-cent increase in bus fares.
A radical splinter teachers' unions led protests in Guerrero State in Mexico, which ended with some demonstrators vandalizing and setting fire to the state education secretary's offices.
The alleged scandal forced the government to shut down its payment system last year to investigate allegations that large sums of money had been stolen by officials.
Number 1, the Arab Spring, Arab League, and more.
So people are flooding from everywhere. We can see them that they are coming from their boroughs and groups, and they are all, coming in front of the Minister of Interior asking for the resignation of the president.
These protests didn't end that long ago, but the effects they've had on the Arab world will be felt forever. Starting in 2010 in Tunisia, the demonstrations would spread to many other countries, and non-Arab country Iran would see major protests as well. Whether violent or non-violent, they had a huge impact on many Arab countries. Leaders of nations like Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya would be forced out of power, and many other countries would see their governments shaken profoundly by the movement.
It was like someone who were assaulting us, who were treating us like dogs. At this moment, I told my friends it's him or me in this country.
Do you agree with our list? What do you think is the most important protest of this century?
All this started right here, this Wall Street. The wall was to keep us out, right?
With thought-provoking top 10s published every day. Be sure to subscribe to WatchMojo.com.
Many Thais see the ruling as a political maneuver by government opponents.